if you're going to confront something that's dangerous enough and informative enough to like virtually kill you, and you're going to survive, what does that mean? It means that your capacity for death and renewal is what saves you. And so, you know, you think about this, partly what it means is that, like, there you are, but you learn something. Okay, well, once you learn something, you're not the same as you were before you learned it, right? There's a transformation. So that means you're the same as you are because you're still there, but you're also different. And then you might also ask yourself, well, what do you give up when you learn something? And that's an interesting question, because you very seldom learn something that's completely without precedent. Now, if you do, that's really shocking generally, but you generally don't. What happens is that you already have a framework of evaluation that you're using to interpret the world. And it, you know, it's good enough to get you from place to place, but it's not 100% accurate. And when you encounter something you didn't expect, or something that's frightening, so that you have to transform your knowledge, generally what happens is you have to lose some of what you already presume before you can learn something new. You know, it's like a prejudice or an oversimplification or an element of your ignorance has to be allowed to die before you can incorporate the information and then grow. And so you might say, well, death is the precondition for learning, at least symbolically speaking, and that's exactly what the phoenix is attempting to represent in the Harry Potter story. Now, who owns the phoenix? Dumbledore, right? And he's sort of god of Hogwarts, so to speak, you know. So the phoenix stands in the same relationship to Dumbledore that Christ stands in relationship to God the Father in Christianity. It's exactly the same kind of idea. Well, it's not exactly the same, obviously, but the underlying structure of the idea is very similar. And if you remember, maybe, what happens to Harry Potter at the very end of the series? What process does he have to go through? He dies, right? And then he comes back to life, right? And he has to die and come back to life in order to defeat evil. So Pinocchio is this fake thing, right? He's like this artificial boy. He's made by Geppetto, who's a pretty good guy. What's Pinocchio trying to do? Right, right. Well, hopefully that's part of what you're trying to do. And hopefully that's a process that this class could conceivably further. So what does Pinocchio have to do in relationship to his father in order to become real? He rescues him, right? What does he do? He goes down to the bottom of the ocean. What does he find there? A whale, weirdly enough. And really weirdly enough, you know, I don't know what a puppet is doing on the bottom of the ocean looking for a whale, but apparently it swallowed his father, which also, none of that makes any sense at all. You realize it makes no sense, but of course you're in there like following it and thinking, yeah, well, I can, you know, I can suspend disbelief. You know, it's just a puppet, wooden puppet. And it's looking for its father at the bottom of the ocean in a whale. That all doesn't make any sense at all, right? It makes no sense whatsoever. But it's a mythological motif. And part of that motif, it's a death and rebirth motif, the going down to the bottom of the ocean and being devoured by something and then coming back up. So that's a death and rebirth motif. But even more importantly, the motif there suggests that you can't stop being a puppet, a marionette. Somebody else is pulling your strings. Something else is pulling your strings. You're a marionette till you rescue your father from the bottom of the ocean. And what does that mean? Well, it means that you're a puppet of forces you do not understand, probably prevailing political attitudes or ideologies or something pathetic like that, until you make the attempt to dive down into the depths and reclaim your identity with history as a phenomena. You know, because you might say, well, why should you study history? It's like, well, history is you. You know, if you're not studying history with the understanding that you're studying yourself, then you don't know what the hell you're doing. And you can't be a complete person because we're cultural people. We're cultural creatures. You can't be a full person until you catalyze your identity with your culture. And it's like an existential obligation. So, and if you don't do it, then you're going to feel all nihilistic and weak, or you're going to be all totalitarian and self-righteous and oppressive and, you know, maybe genocidal and deadly. So it's not something that you can just brush off. You have to do it. It's part of it. And now Isis is goddess of the underworld. And she's also a goddess of chaos. And so she's the goddess of the place that you go when things fall apart around you. And it's worthwhile thinking of that as a domain. And you know what that's like. So, okay, so a dream falls apart, or a vision falls apart, or you get dumped by someone you love, or you get betrayed, or you fail, or maybe you just have, you know, maybe you have maybe you have clinical depression, or you're hyper anxious, or you have some negative emotion pathology. Well, that's a state of being, right? You can think about it as a place, and that place is the underworld. The underworld is where you go when things fall apart. And the representation for the Egyptians of the underworld was primarily Isis. She was the personified figure that represented the domain that was underneath normative knowledge. And the reason she was female, it's very complicated, and like I said last time, I really don't have time to explain it in depth, unfortunately, but part of the reason that the underworld is given feminine qualities, there's lots of reasons, but one of them is that kind of the defining feature of the feminine is that from which new forms emerge. That's almost like, there's other ways of defining female, but that's our feminine, but that's a pretty good one. It's a pretty universal one. And the unknown is feminine because the unknown is the place from which all new forms emerge, right? So when you interact with the unknown on a voluntary basis, which can be symbolized sexually, which often happened with Freud's thinking and with his clients, you bring forth something new. And so it's a terrifying place to descend into. It can be hellish, because hell is actually like the worst suburb of the unknown. And I'm sure some of you have been there too. So, or maybe you're there now, or maybe you know people who are there. So it's a very, very rough place to visit, especially if you do it accidentally. And if you go there especially accidentally, you might never come out. But if you do come out, maybe you've learned something. Maybe you're new in some way. All right, so that's Isis. And Isis is the wife of Osiris, or Osiris, who's in the middle, standing on a pillar there. He's the father, and he's a pillar because culture is like the pillars that hold things up. And so in the Egyptian story, Osiris was an old king, and he was kind of willfully blind. He didn't really know what was going on anymore, and he didn't pay sufficient attention, and he had an evil brother, by the way, whose name was Seth, and Seth eventually chops him up, wants to take over the kingdom, and scatters him all over the kingdom. He can't kill him because he's a god, and Isis comes up from the underworld and finds Osiris's phallus and makes herself pregnant, and she gives birth to Horus, who's the guy on the left. And Horus is sort of like King Arthur, or any number of orphans. He grows up, or like that lion in The Lion King. Simba, you know how Simba grows up basically outside of the damaged kingdom, right? And it's taken over by Scar. It's exactly the same story. It's exactly the same story. And Horus grows up outside the kingdom, and when he grows up, he can really see Horus. That's why his symbol is the eye. He goes back and he can see evil. He's not blind like his father, which is the difference between you guys and dead culture, right? So you're cultural organisms, but you're not dead. You can see and you can update yourself. So you're like the living embodiments of history. And the living embodiments of history have to know what history is and incorporate it into themselves, but also be awake enough to alter it where that alteration is necessary, especially when they're doing that to further their knowledge of the unknown and also to triumph over evil. So anyways, Horus grows up outside, but like he can see, he's different than Osiris, partly because he's young, and he knows that his uncle is evil, and he goes back and has a terrible fight with him. And during the fight, Seth, his uncle, tears out one of his eyes, because it's no joke to confront evil. It's no joke. It can damage your consciousness. Anyways, Horus wins, and he gets his eye back, and then he banishes Seth to the nether regions of the kingdom, because you can't get rid of him either. You can't kill him. He's the potential for corruption in an institution is always there, so there's no permanently getting rid of it. There's only controlling it from time to time. Anyways, so he gets his eye back, and then instead of putting it back in his head and being king, which you'd expect him to do, he goes back down to the underworld. And he finds his father there, because his father, chopped up, is also a spirit who inhabits the underworld. And he gives his father the eye. And then the two of them go back and rule the kingdom together. I tell you, it's one of the world's most brilliant stories. It's a staggeringly brilliant story, because it says that active youth should be the guiding property of the state, because the Horus-Osiris combination was actually what the pharaoh imitated when he was being a good pharaoh. It's dynamic vision that should be the guiding principle of the state, but it should be allied with tradition. It's brilliant. You know, it's one of the things that the radical revolutionaries of the 1960s never figured out. It's like, well, don't trust anybody over 30. Well, that's a really stupid idea, especially since you're going to spend two-thirds of your life over 30. What the hell good is that? So the idea is that you're supposed to embody your tradition and be awake at the same time. And that if you do that, then you'd be a good ruler of, you know, of yourself, of your little family, and if you have opportunities beyond that, then of whatever organizations you happen to be involved in. That's exactly what should be happening to you at university. It's the whole point of going to university. You know, it's not a trade school, not that there's anything wrong with trade schools, quite the contrary, but that's not what university is for. It's to turn you into creatures that aren't marionettes. And to do that, you have to follow a mythological path. Or you can be chaotic and random. Those are, like I said, subject to some idiotic totalitarian ideology, but, you know, I wouldn't recommend either of those paths because they're not going to get you very far for very long. So, that's the Egyptians. Brilliant, and it's not like they understood that story. They told it. That's different. It's just like, you think, well, how can you tell something you don't understand? It's like, just like you can watch Harry Potter and not have a clue what's going on. It's exactly the same thing, and part of it is that you have levels of understanding that make you up, but that you don't simultaneously understand. You can't articulate them. So you're a multi-leveled creature, and the part of you that's conscious and articulate is floating on a massive substructure that's neither conscious nor articulate. You know, that's in some sense striving to become conscious and articulate, but that can never be completely either of those things. So it's part of the pain of being half spirit and half matter. And so then on the right, you know, you have another set of symbols which are quite similar. Although, you know, they come about the story in a completely different way. So I told you a little bit about them before. You have Mary at the top, and she's represented here as that which encloses everything, right? And so in that representation, culture is the child of nature. That's one way of looking at the statue. There are many ways of looking at this statue. That's the other thing that's strange about symbolic representations, because in some sense you can't exhaust them with words. There's always something more you can say about them. And that's partly because they're associated with everything. And so if something is associated with everything, then you can talk about it forever and you never run out of things to say. They're inexhaustible. So, and you have God the Father, who we already talked about, and then if you notice in that image, I hope you can see that, the figure is open and there's a crowd of people gathered around, right? And they're all looking at the central symbol, which is the crucifix. And, you know, you might be thinking that, you know, billions of people over the last 2,000 years have spent a substantial amount of time doing nothing but gazing at the crucifix. It's like, why? You know, and one answer is, well, those people are all superstitious. They believe in stupid things like, you know, death and resurrection and, you know, the virgin birth and all those things that make no empirical sense. It's like, yeah, well, think again. You know, it's not a matter of simplistic belief. It's a matter of belief structures that are so profound that you can't articulate them. You don't know what they mean. And so to gaze on the figure of the dying and resurrecting hero is to understand that a huge part of what redeems you in life from evil and from the things that terrify you is your capacity to let go of things that are outmoded and dead and to revitalize them as a consequence of new learning. And it's the very soul, it's your very soul, it's the living part of you. And that's the thing that's so interesting about this is, according to the wisdom traditions of mankind, that's the part of your spirit that protects you against fear and pain. Because you might say, well, you know, if you don't want fear and you don't want pain, you should build a big wall around yourself and wrap yourself up in styrofoam and sit right in the middle, you know, where nothing bad is ever going to happen to you. But, you know, first of all, that's obviously ridiculous, and second of all, you die of boredom in no time flat if you did that. You cannot be protected from the things that frighten you and hurt you. But if you identify with the part of your being that has the capacity for transformation, then you're always the equal of what it is that's opposing you, or maybe more than the equal of it. So you can either depend on the walls that protect you from things, and so those could be like actual walls or cultural walls or totalitarian beliefs or rigid thought patterns or anything like that, or you can rely instead on the part of you that's voluntarily able to confront things that are frightening and painful and triumph. And the deepest story of humankind is that that's the part of us that's the most powerful. You know, weak as we are and subject as we are to all sorts of terrible things, what do you need for protection? That's what you need. You have to be willing to let go and come back, and let go and come back, and then you can stay dynamic through the ups and downs of your life. It makes you incredibly strong.